The boots come down in the dry grass before first light. Not heavily, not with any particular urgency. The way a man walks a pasture he has walked 100 times, moving through the low scrub with the particular economy of someone who knows exactly how far the ground goes before it rises toward the fence line. Mac Brazel covered this pasture most mornings. He knew where the rock outcroppings broke the flatness, where the sheep tended to drift overnight, where the soil went slightly darker in the arroyos after what little rain the season offered. He walked it the way a man walks his own work, not looking for anything, already knowing what he would find. What he found on that morning in mid-June 1947 was not what he knew. The Foster Ranch sits roughly 75 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico, in the high desert scrubland of Lincoln County. The land runs flat and pale under a sky that seems to begin very low at the horizon and rises enormous before it. The grasses are sparse and dry. The soil holds little moisture. In summer, the heat comes early, stays late, and the ranch roads, unpaved, pale with dust, connect this particular stretch of rangeland to the wider world by long, slow distances. William Brazel had been the foreman here long enough that the land's rhythms were his own rhythms. The seasons, the animals, the work, the particular quiet of a New Mexico morning before the heat arrived. The debris was spread across a long corridor of ground. It lay in a field of roughly 3/4 of a mile, end to end, oriented in a single direction, as though whatever had produced it had been moving when it came apart. Brazel walked the length of it that first morning, and then walked it again. The material was unlike anything the ranch had produced. Not equipment, not fence wire, not the remnants of anything he could account for from ordinary operations. There were strips of something that resembled rubber, lightweight and thin. There were pieces of what looked like tinfoil, but behaved differently under his hands. There were short lengths of what seemed to be sticks, unusually light, more like the lightest possible balsa than anything structural. There was a tough, papery material, and there were pieces of something else, a stronger substance, difficult to work with his fingers, that resisted the kind of casual testing a man naturally applies to an unfamiliar material. He could not easily cut it, could not easily tear it, and when he tried to mark it with a match, the flame seemed to accomplish nothing lasting. He gathered some of it and looked at the rest. The scale of the field was the thing that stayed with him. This was not a small scatter, a piece of something fallen from a passing aircraft, the kind of minor debris that occasionally appeared in remote rangeland and meant nothing. The corridor stretched long across his pasture, several 100 feet wide in places, the material distributed with a kind of directionality that spoke of something moving through space, above and coming apart as it went. Whatever this was had been somewhere overhead, and then it was here, across 3/4 of a mile of dry New Mexico ground, lying in the early summer heat, with no one but Mac Brazel to see it. He carried some of the material to the ranch shed. The shed sat on the property, the way ranch outbuildings sit, practical, weathered, not built for anything more than function. Its door stood slightly open through those June days, the way it often did, and inside, in the shade and relative cool, Brazel stacked the pieces he had gathered. They were light enough that carrying them presented no difficulty. The foil-like strips, the rubber pieces, the unusual sticks. He set them against the shed wall and went back to his work. The Foster Ranch did not stop operating because something unusual had come down in the south pasture. There were animals to manage, fences to check, the ordinary continuing demands of a working property in the high desert summer. Brazel kept the debris where it was and kept doing his job. He did not report what he had found for approximately 3 weeks. This is one of the first things worth sitting with when following this story from its beginning. A man finds a long field of unusual material across his employer's property in the remote New Mexico desert and does not immediately drive into town to report it. He stores some of it in a shed. He goes about his work. 3 weeks pass. The debris lies in the shed through the heat of late June and into early July. This is not the behavior of a man in a state of alarm. It is the behavior of a man who found something puzzling, and living as far from official processes as the Foster Ranch placed him, did not feel the particular urgency that proximity to news and institutions tends to create. The ranch was remote. The roads were unpaved. The nearest town of any size was a long drive south across flat desert. Whatever this was, it had been lying here before he found it, and it would keep lying here while he finished what needed finishing. What changed his timeline was the radio. In the late days of June and the first days of July 1947, American radio broadcasts were carrying a particular kind of story. Civilians across the Pacific Northwest and the broader western United States had been reporting sightings of unusual objects in the sky, fast-moving, silent or nearly so, disc-shaped according to some accounts, and behaving in ways that did not match the aircraft of the period. The term that had begun to circulate was flying discs. The reports were being taken seriously enough to generate national coverage, and the coverage reached even the radio sets of remote working ranches in Lincoln County, New Mexico. Brazel listened to these reports and looked at the material in his shed. The connection was not a certainty. He did not claim to have witnessed anything in the sky. He had found debris on the ground, unusual material in a long directional field, and now the radio was describing objects in the sky that people could not readily identify. He was not a man given to dramatic conclusions. He was a ranch foreman. But the debris was there, and the broadcasts were there, and the combination of the two was apparently enough to bring him south, down the Pale Ranch Road toward Roswell on the morning of July 7th, 1947. It was a Monday. The summer heat was already established by the time he reached town. He brought a small sample of material with him. The Chavez County Sheriff's Office sat in Roswell in the way that a county seat's law enforcement office tends to sit. Present, institutional, unremarkable, the kind of building that handles the ordinary range of rural concerns and civic administration without particular drama. Sheriff George Wilcox had held the office long enough to know his county and the people in it. Brazel was not an unknown figure. The Foster Ranch was in his jurisdiction. The conversation that took place between them on the afternoon of July 7th was by all accounts low-key, a working man describing something he had found on his pasture, laying a small piece of material on the desk between them, explaining the dimensions of the field, the approximate date of discovery, his 3 weeks of continued observation. Wilcox looked at the sample. It was not by the physical description that has survived a dramatic object, a piece of something unusual, lightweight, with properties under handling that did not correspond to familiar materials, not obviously technological, not obviously anything in particular. The kind of thing a reasonable person could hold in both hands for a long moment and still not be certain what they were looking at. Wilcox listened to the account of the debris field's extent, the corridor across the pasture, the material in the shed, the direction of the scatter. He thought about it the way a county official thinks about something that does not fit his existing categories. He was not certain what to make of it. This uncertainty was reasonable. The year was 1947. The world was 2 years out of the largest conflict in human history. and the pace of technological development in that period was such that unusual objects, unusual materials, and unusual phenomena might plausibly originate from any number of military programs operating in the extensive testing ranges of the American Southwest. The White Sands Proving Ground was not far. Alamogordo was a military installation with ongoing classified programs. The general population of southeastern New Mexico had lived alongside military activity long enough to understand that not everything visible in the sky or recoverable from the desert was meant to be explained to civilians. Wilcox sat in this context. The debris Brazel had brought was unusual, but the category of things it might belong to remained genuinely open. He decided, after considering it, to make a phone call. The telephone on the wall of the Chavez County Sheriff's Office was a standard instrument of the period, the handset heavy, the connection routed through an exchange, the kind of call that connected a county office to a military installation by a process slightly more deliberate than a modern phone call suggests. The number for Roswell Army Airfield was the appropriate one. The base was the military authority with jurisdiction over this stretch of New Mexico. If the debris was military in origin, they would know what it was. If it wasn't, they would know who to contact. Either way, the decision to call was the obvious one for a county official who had found himself holding something he could not categorize. Wilcox reached the base. He described what Brazel had brought him. The call was received. What followed from that call happened quickly, more quickly than the 3 weeks preceding it, more quickly than the pace of ranch life and rural reporting suggested the situation warranted. Within hours, the conversation between a county sheriff and an unidentified ranch foreman had become a formal military response. The 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield, the most sophisticated bomb wing in the post-war United States Air Forces, the unit that had delivered the atomic weapons over Japan 2 years before, now had the Foster Ranch debris on its operational agenda. The gap between Mac Brazel walking his dry pasture in mid-June and the military moving toward it in early July was a single telephone call from a county office. That is worth holding for a moment. The scale of what that gap represents. The debris had been lying in the pasture and in the ranch shed for approximately 3 weeks while Brazel went about his ordinary work. It had been gathered, examined casually, stacked against the wall of an outbuilding in the high desert heat, and left there. No alarm, no urgency, no sense, on the part of the man who found it, that he was in possession of something that required immediate official attention. Just unusual material in a shed, on a remote ranch, on the long flat plain of Lincoln County. And then the phone rang at the base. The Foster Ranch itself contributed to the particular shape of what would follow. Its distance from Roswell, 75 miles of mostly unpaved road across flat, sparsely populated desert, meant that access to the property required deliberate travel. There were no casual observers. The roads that served the ranch connected it to the world through a narrow and controllable channel. The nearest neighbors were not neighbors in any suburban sense, other ranch operations at similar distances, separated by the same kind of open ground. A military cordon around the debris field, when one was established, would not have required closing off a populated area or managing public witnesses who had happened across the scene. It required managing one unpaved road across rangeland. Most people had no reason to travel. This geometry shaped everything that came next. The high desert of Lincoln County was already a landscape accustomed to official restriction. The proving grounds to the west, the base to the south, the general understanding in that region that certain stretches of the American Southwest had been committed to military purposes Since the war, civilians understood that some things seen in the desert sky or found on the desert floor belonged to programs they were not cleared to know about. The general atmosphere was one of managed information, not hostile, not alarming, simply the background condition of living near active military testing ranges in the first years of the Cold War. Brazel had grown up and worked in this atmosphere. His 3-week delay in reporting was not strange within it. His eventual report was not strange within it either. What was strange was the material, the foil-like strips that returned to their original shape when crumpled, the balsalite sticks that would not break in the expected ways, the tough papery substance, the harder material that resisted being cut or burned. These were Brazel's descriptions, specific, physical, based on hands-on handling over several weeks of ordinary ranch life. He was a working man, not a scientist, not a military analyst, and his account was a working man's account. Here is what it felt like to hold. Here is what it would and would not do. Here is how much of it there was, and how far it stretched across the pasture. The pasture itself retained its orientation. Debris fields have a geometry that reflects whatever produced them. The long corridor that Brazel found running across 3/4 of a mile of Foster Ranch scrubland had a direction to it. The material did not scatter randomly in all directions from a central point, but stretched in a corridor, the way something moving overhead leaves its trace on the ground below. This direction was something Brazel noticed. It was something any experienced outdoorsman would notice. The field pointed somewhere. Whatever came apart in that direction had been going somewhere when it came apart. He collected what he could carry and left the rest. The shed held its pieces through the final weeks of June. The pasture held its larger scatter through the same weeks, or most of it. Some of the material, the pieces too numerous or too scattered for a single man to gather on his own, remained where it had fallen, pressed lightly into the dry grass by the weight of the New Mexico summer. The heat did not change it. The wind moved across it. The ranch went on around it. On the morning of July 7th, 1947, Brazel got into his vehicle. The road south to Roswell from the Foster Ranch runs across the high desert, the way those roads run, pale, straight for long distances, the flatness of the land making the horizon seem very far and very wide. The drive took time. It gave a man time to think about what he was doing and why. Brazel had been carrying this for 3 weeks. The radio had given him a frame for it. Flying disc reports from across the Pacific Northwest, descriptions of unusual objects in the sky over Washington State and Oregon and California. The general national awareness that something was being seen that people could not readily explain. He was not claiming his debris was connected to any of that. He was a practical man. He simply had unusual material on his property, and the radio had introduced the possibility that the category it belonged to might already have a name. The drive south was long and quiet. Roswell in the summer of 1947 was a working city of the American Southwest, not large, not small, built around the commerce and agriculture and military presence that defined that region in the post-war years. The Army airfield to the south of town was a significant presence. The 509th Bomb Group gave the city a particular identity, the most accomplished bombing unit of the war, the unit attached to the atomic missions over Japan, now stationed here in the New Mexico desert, in what was both a strategic location and a kind of deliberate remoteness. The city understood its military neighbor. The relationship was ordinary and unremarkable in the way that military installations and their host communities tend to develop an ordinary and unremarkable relationship over time. Brazel drove into town and found the sheriff's office. Wilcox listened to him the way a county official listens to a report. He cannot immediately categorize, carefully, without alarm, with the practiced patience of someone who has heard many things across a career spent at the intersection of rural life and civic authority. The piece of material on the desk between them caught whatever light fell across the counter of the county office. It was not impressive, not threatening, not obviously anything particular. It was a small piece of something unusual, and attached to it was a description of 3/4 of a mile of similar material lying across a pasture on a ranch, 75 miles north. Wilcox looked at it for a moment. He was not an easily alarmed man. The records that survive from this period suggest a methodical, steady figure, a sheriff who took his responsibilities seriously and operated within the institutional framework available to him. What Brazel had brought was outside that framework. It was not a crime. It was not an emergency. It was a piece of unusual material and an account of a large debris field on private property in the remote desert. The appropriate response was to refer it upward, to the authority that might actually know what this was. The telephone on the wall, the handset heavy in his hand, the connection made, the voice at the base, the description offered, a ranch foreman, a debris field, some unusual material, the foreman present in the office with a sample, the base receiving this, and somewhere in the chain of authority at Roswell Army Airfield, a decision being made to treat the report as something that required a response. This is where the story changes its pace. Up to this point, from the mid-June morning when Brazel first walked the debris field through 3 weeks of ranch work and a long drive south on a July morning, the story had the pace of ordinary life in the high desert, unhurried, personal, rooted in the specific textures of working land and working people. A man found something. He thought about it. He eventually reported it. The institutions of county government received the report in the ordinary way and passed it on to the appropriate authority. And then the base moved. The speed with which the military responded to Wilcox's call was, in retrospect, one of the first things that distinguished this particular debris report from others. Within hours of the call, the incident had an official designation, an assigned officer, a chain of command engaged with it. The Foster Ranch was no longer simply a remote stretch of Lincoln County rangeland. It was a location with military significance. The unpaved road north from Roswell was about to carry official vehicles, and the debris in Mac Brazel's shed was about to have an audience considerably more consequential than the county sheriff. None of this was visible yet from inside the county office. Wilcox set the handset back on the cradle. The small piece of material remained on the desk. Brazel stood at the counter. The afternoon light moved across the room in the quiet way. Light moves in county offices in small southwestern cities, the kind of light that has been falling on county desks since these buildings were built, indifferent to the particular significance of any one afternoon's business. The piece of debris sat between them, without indicating anything about what it would eventually become. The ranch shed sat 75 miles north, with the rest of the material stacked in its shade, the door standing slightly open, the heat of early July settling over the Lincoln County desert. The pasture beyond the shed held the larger scatter, the long corridor running 3/4 of a mile across dry scrubland, the material pressed lightly into the pale grass, the direction of its distribution pointing across the open desert toward whatever it had been coming from. The road north from Roswell lay pale and straight under the wide New Mexico sky, the kind of sky that seems to offer no privacy, no cover, no possibility of anything happening on the ground beneath it, without being entirely visible. And yet things had been happening under it for 3 weeks without any official knowledge. The debris had been there, the shed had been there. The foreman had been walking his pasture every morning and going about his work every day. And the long corridor of unusual material had been lying there through the early summer heat, exactly as it had fallen. Wilcox reached for the telephone. The call was already placed, the sequence already initiated, the chain of authority already in motion from the moment the base answered. But the image is worth holding, the small piece of unusual material on the county desk, the two men standing in the quiet afternoon room, and the phone on the wall with the handset lifted. What moves through that connection moves quietly, through institutional channels, in the particular way that official responses move when they are working properly and have not yet attracted any attention beyond the parties immediately involved. The sheriff had done what a sheriff does. He had received an unusual report, assessed it within his available frame of reference, and referred it to the authority best positioned to evaluate it. The material on his desk was not his to explain. The debris field on the Foster Ranch was not his jurisdiction, in the way that crimes and civil matters were his jurisdiction. He was passing it appropriately, doing his job, maintaining the ordinary function of county governance in the first days of July, 1947. The piece of material sat in the quiet for a moment, unremarked upon, slightly out of place on the county desk, holding whatever properties had made Brazel think to bring it in. And the sheriff's hand was already moving toward the telephone. Major Jesse Marcel drove west out of Roswell in the late evening of July 7th, 1947, the headlights of his car carrying only a short distance into the desert dark ahead. The road to the Foster Ranch ran unpaved and pale through flat scrubland, the kind of road that demands nothing of a driver's attention and gives nothing back, no landmarks, no markers, no indication of how far the next turning might be. He had been assigned the task by his commanding officer earlier that afternoon, after a local rancher named Brazel had walked into the Chaves County Sheriff's Office with an account and a small fragment of material that nobody in the building knew quite what to make of. The assignment was, on its face, a straightforward one. Drive out. Assess what was there. Report back. Marcel held the rank of major and the title of intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield. The 509th was not an ordinary unit. It was the only atomic-capable bomb group in the United States military at that time, the same group that had carried the missions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki 2 years before, and its intelligence officer was accordingly a man who had been trained to evaluate unusual materials and unusual situations without losing his composure. If any officer on the base was suited to the task of driving out into the New Mexico desert to look at a debris field and determine whether it warranted further attention, it was him. The car moved through the dark. The ranch was roughly 75 miles north of Roswell, and the road was exactly as long and as empty as the distance required it to be. He would not arrive at the debris field until the following morning. The darkness and the terrain made a thorough examination impossible that first night, and Marcel spent what remained of the evening in the company of Mac Brazel, the ranch foreman who had first found the wreckage and whose account had started everything moving. By the time the sun came up over the flat eastern horizon on July 8, 1947, Marcel was already in the field, moving through dry scrubland across an area that Brazel had described as roughly 3/4 of a mile long, the debris oriented in a single direction, as though whatever had come apart had been moving when it did. What Marcel found there, by his own later account, was unlike anything his military career had prepared him for. He described material that would not dent, would not burn, and returned to its original shape when crumpled and released. He described the field as extensive, the material as scattered, and his own response as one of genuine bewilderment, not alarm, exactly, but a considered professional bewilderment, the kind that comes from holding something in one's hands and finding that none of the categories available are the right ones. The material was gathered. Some portion of it was loaded into Marcel's car and into the vehicle of Captain Sheridan Cavett, who had accompanied him from the base. The drive back to Roswell Army Airfield covered the same pale road in reverse, the car carrying whatever had been lying in that pasture since some time in mid-June, and the base receiving it quietly on the morning of July 8th without the kind of formal ceremony that would later be attached to the story in popular retelling. Marcel reportedly stopped at his own home that morning before continuing to the base, and it was there, in the early hours, that he spread some of the recovered material on the kitchen floor and let his wife and young son examine it. That detail would not become part of the public record for another 30 years. What happened next on the base moved quickly, and the speed of it is among the more notable features of the sequence. Colonel William Blanchard commanded the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield, and by the morning of July 8th he had personally reviewed the situation and made a decision that remains, depending on one's reading of it, either entirely understandable or entirely inexplicable. He authorized the release of a public statement. The statement was drafted and issued by First Lieutenant Walter Haught, the base's public information officer, and it carried the authority of the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield when it went out over the wire services at approximately midday on July 8, 1947. The language of the release was spare and precise. It stated that personnel from the 509th Bomb Group had recovered a flying disc that had landed on a ranch in the Roswell region and that the object had been forwarded to higher headquarters. That was, in its essentials, the whole of it. There was no elaboration, no caveat, no speculative language of the sort that a cautious public affairs officer might have attached to qualify an unusual claim. The release read as a statement of established fact. A disc had been recovered. The 509th had it. It was going up the chain. The wire services received the text and moved it immediately, and within hours the story was running on radio broadcasts and in newspaper front pages across the United States and in several other countries. The Roswell Daily Record ran a headline that afternoon that confirmed flatly the recovery of a flying saucer. Blanchard was by any measure a serious and careful officer. His career at that point already bore the marks of genuine distinction and the trajectory it would take in subsequent decades, ultimately reaching the rank of 4-star general before his death in 1966, was the trajectory of a man the Air Force considered reliable and sound. The research community has returned to this point many times across the decades, that a man of Blanchard's standing, commanding the most sensitive bomb group in the American military, authorizing a press release of that nature, was not the act of someone careless or confused. It was a deliberate institutional decision made by a decorated officer on the morning of July 8, 1947, and the press release it produced went out over the wire services, with his name attached to it. Within hours, the story changed. Brigadier General Roger Ramey commanded the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, and by the afternoon of July 8th, he had been contacted by the chain of command and was preparing a press conference of his own. Marcel received orders to fly to Fort Worth with at least a portion of the recovered material, and he did so, the flight covering several hundred miles in the same afternoon that Haught's press release was still being picked up by radio stations and regional newspapers across the country. What happened at Fort Worth that afternoon was brief and consequential, and it closed off the story with a speed that by any measure was striking. Ramey convened a press conference at his office at Fort Worth Army Airfield. The some material of some kind, was arranged on the floor, and photographers were admitted to document it. Ramey's weather officer, Warrant Officer Irving Newton, was brought in to stand beside the debris and describe what he saw. Newton's assessment was immediate and unambiguous. He identified the recovered material as the remains of a standard weather balloon, specifically a high-altitude balloon with a radar reflector target attached, a type of equipment that the Army Air Forces used routinely for meteorological observation, familiar to any weather officer who had been in the service for more than a few months. Newton stated for the record that the material on the floor of General Ramey's office was unambiguously consistent with that identification. The press conference ended. Photographers had their images. The correction moved over the wire services by early the following morning. The standard weather balloon explanation replaced the flying disc in the public record essentially overnight. News organizations that had run the flying disc story on July 8th ran the correction on July 9th, and the story, which had briefly occupied front pages across the country, retreated into the background noise of a summer that had already seen a number of flying disc reports circulating in the American press. The correction was accepted. The incident did not become a matter of sustained public interest in 1947. It was filed, for the most part, as a minor episode of wartime-era institutional miscommunication, a local press release that had gotten ahead of itself, corrected quickly by the relevant authority, followed by nothing further worth examining. Marcel, for his part, was in the room during the Fort Worth press conference. He stood beside the material that had been arranged on the floor and was photographed there. Images that would circulate for decades, reproduced in every serious treatment of the Roswell case, showing an officer in uniform kneeling or standing beside material that Newton had just described as a weather balloon and radar reflector. Marcel's expression in the photographs is calm and composed, the expression of a trained intelligence officer in a controlled institutional setting, giving nothing away. He did not speak to reporters. He had been instructed not to, and he followed that instruction without apparent objection. When the press conference concluded, he was put on a military aircraft back to Roswell, and he left Fort Worth carrying no debris. Whatever he had brought with him was no longer in his possession, and having made no public statement to the assembled press. The question that would return again and again across the following decades was a simple one. The material photographed on the floor of General Ramey's office, did it match what Marcel had picked up from the ground on the Foster Ranch? Marcel's answer, offered privately and then eventually on the record, was that it did not. The debris shown in the Fort Worth photographs, he said, was not the material he had brought from the Foster Ranch. A substitution had been made before the photographers were admitted. The material that had spent the night in the pasture at the J.B. Foster Ranch, the material whose properties he had spent the morning of July 8th attempting to understand, was not the material that appeared in the images transmitted to wire services across the country that afternoon. Marcel maintained this position consistently across every account he gave in the years and decades that followed, and he never retracted it, and he never qualified it in a way that suggested uncertainty about what he had seen or what had been substituted for it. He also never said so publicly in 1947. The instruction not to speak to the press was given and followed, and the years between July 1947 and the late 1970s passed without Marcel placing any of this on the record. He continued his military career. He served in other capacities, in other assignments. The 509th moved on. Roswell Army Airfield was deactivated and eventually converted to civilian use. The Roswell incident, the name it did not yet have, settled quietly into the official record as a resolved matter, a case of weather balloon debris misidentified by an excitable rancher and corrected by the proper authority without further incident. It is worth attending to the specific institutional chain of the correction, because the chain itself carries a kind of weight that is independent of what the material actually was. The original press release went out under the authority of Colonel Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th. The correction came from General Ramey, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force, Blanchard's superior. The weather officer who made the identification was a warrant officer, junior in rank to Marcel, and the identification was made at a press conference called by the general, not in the field where the debris was found. The sequence runs from field assessment by the base intelligence officer to press release authorized by the base commander to correction issued by the base commander's superior at a press conference organized by that superior, with a junior weather officer providing the official explanation. Each step in that chain involved a more senior authority than the last, and the final word came from the highest-ranking officer involved in the episode at any point. The sequence is, in isolation, entirely consistent with normal institutional operation, a mistake being corrected by the appropriate authority, the chain of command functioning as intended. It is also considered from a different angle exactly the sequence that a correction designed to close down a sensitive matter would follow. The record does not specify which of these readings is accurate. The record simply shows the sequence. Blanchard's authorization of the original release has remained a persistent complication for the weather balloon explanation, not because it is impossible that a base commander would authorize an erroneous press release, but because of the specificity of the error. The 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield in July 1947 was not a base likely to confuse a weather balloon with something unusual. Roswell was home to the most technically sophisticated military aviation unit in the United States at that time, staffed with officers and personnel who had worked with experimental aircraft and high-altitude equipment throughout and after the war. The suggestion that the intelligence officer of that unit, accompanied by a counterintelligence officer, spent a morning examining weather balloon remnants and came away unable to identify them correctly is a suggestion that sits at some tension with the professional environment they worked in. Irving Newton himself, interviewed in later years, acknowledged that the radar reflector targets used in the kind of balloon assemblies he identified in Ramey's office could look unusual to someone unfamiliar with them. The foil-covered balsa frames and printed tape markings were not everyday objects, and a rancher encountering one in a remote pasture might reasonably not know what it was. But Newton also distinguished between a rancher and a military intelligence officer with Marcel's background and training. The question of whether Marcel could have genuinely failed to identify what Newton immediately recognized as standard equipment was one that Newton, to his credit, engaged with rather than dismissing. The photographs taken in Ramey's office that afternoon are among the most studied images in the documentary record of the Roswell case. There are several of them, taken by a Fort Worth Star-Telegram photographer named J. Bon Johnson, and they show General Ramey, Marcel, and the material on the floor from various angles in the flat overhead light of an Air Force office. Researchers examining the photographs over subsequent decades have focused particular attention on a document visible in Ramey's hand in one of the images. A folded paper whose text is not fully legible in the available photographic resolution, but whose presence in the frame has generated sustained analysis. Digital enhancement efforts conducted at various times have produced interpretations of partial words and phrases that advocates of a cover-up have read as confirmation of something more significant than a weather balloon, though the legibility of the text has never been established to a standard that would qualify as documentary evidence. The photographs themselves, whatever they do or do not show, are genuine contemporary records from July 8th, 1947. They show real material, real officers, a real press conference. They are among the very few contemporaneous physical documents from the day itself that have been publicly available for examination across the decades. Everything else from that afternoon, the material Marcel brought, the material photographed, any paperwork generated at Fort Worth in connection with the press conference, either does not appear in the public record or has not been released. The photographs are what survived the day in a form accessible to anyone who wanted to look. Marcel flew back to Roswell without speaking to anyone outside official channels. The story was already settled by the time he landed. The wire services had the correction. Newspapers across the country were preparing their July 9th editions with the weather balloon as the established explanation. The flying disc press release was not being reported as a deliberate institutional act that had been walked back under orders from a superior. It was being reported as an honest mistake, a piece of wreckage misidentified by a rancher, cleaned up quickly by the people responsible. The correction had the texture of a minor administrative embarrassment, not a significant institutional reversal. The 509th Bomb Group continued its operations at Roswell Army Airfield without further public comment on the incident. Blanchard, who had authorized the press release, remained in command. Haught, who had drafted and issued it, remained on base. Marcel, who had recovered the material and identified it as something his military career had not prepared him to recognize, continued in his intelligence officer role and said nothing further for the public record. The summer of 1947 moved into August and then into autumn, and the Roswell weather balloon correction settled into the background of a country that had many other things to attend to. What persisted, invisible to anyone outside the 509th and the chain of command above it, was Marcel's private account, the one he carried through a long military career and into retirement, the one that differed from the official record on the specific question of what had been on the floor of Rami's office. He told no one who would put it on the record. The account traveled with him through the years, private and unverified, through his subsequent postings and his retirement and the long quiet years afterward in Houma, Louisiana, where he eventually settled. It was there, decades later, that a researcher found him. The interval between Marcel's return from Fort Worth on the evening of July 8th, 1947, and his first on-record account to a researcher in the late 1970s spans approximately 30 years of silence, 3 decades during which the official explanation stood unchallenged in any serious public forum, during which the material from the Foster Ranch had presumably been assessed, classified, and placed wherever the relevant authority determined it should go, and during which the people who had been present for the events of those few days in July continued their lives without placing contradictory testimony into any public record. The correction, in other words, had held, not because there were no other accounts, but because the other accounts were not yet public, and the official record was, for 30 years, the only record most people had access to. That is a particular kind of durability, an official explanation that holds for 30 years, not because it has been tested and confirmed, but because the conditions under which it might have been tested, researchers asking questions, Witnesses speaking on record, documents being requested through formal channels had not yet materialized, is a different thing from an explanation that has withstood genuine scrutiny. The Ramey weather balloon explanation was, for the first 30 years of its existence, an explanation that had never been seriously challenged, primarily because the only people positioned to challenge it had not done so, and by their own later accounts, had been told not to. The July 8th correction remains the official position of the United States Air Force. Weather balloon, radar reflector target, rancher who could not identify what he had found, base intelligence officer who recovered it under conditions that contributed to a misidentification, press release that should not have been issued, corrected promptly by the appropriate authority. That is the account in the official record as of this writing, and it has been the account in the official record since the afternoon of July 8th, 1947, when Newton stood beside the material in Ramey's office and named what he saw. What changed, beginning in the late 1970s, was not the official record. The official record did not change. What changed was the existence of alternative accounts, Marcel's, and others documented and preserved in a form that placed them alongside the official record in a way that made the gap between the two visible to anyone who wanted to look at them together. And the gap was, by any measure, a particular kind of gap. On one side, the official account, consistent and unchanged since July 1947, supported by the press conference photographs and Newton's identification and the authority of General Ramey's rank. On the other, Marcel's account, private for 30 years, then stated and restated consistently until his death in 1986, to the effect that the material on Ramey's floor was not what he had brought from the Foster Ranch, and that the material he had actually recovered was something his career had given him no category for. The press release sits in the institutional record of the 509th Bomb Group as an acknowledged document. Its existence has not been disputed, its text has not been revised, and the authority under which it was issued has been consistently acknowledged. What was recovered and what it was remain. In the official account, answered questions. In Marcel's account, they remain something else. Marcel boarded the military aircraft back to Roswell, with the evening already deep behind the western horizon, carrying nothing from the press conference, and having said nothing to the reporters who had been present in the building. The story was already moving in the other direction, already settling into the weather balloon version that would stand for 3 decades as the final word. He had been in the field that morning. He had held the material. He had formed his assessment, and then he had watched in the flat light of a general's office at Fort Worth Army Airfield as a warrant officer named Newton described something on the floor as ordinary equipment, and the cameras recorded it as the official conclusion, and the reporters filed their copy, and the wire machines began transmitting the correction that would close the story before midnight. Whatever he thought about it, whatever passed through the mind of the 509th's intelligence officer as he sat in that aircraft and watched Fort Worth recede through the porthole window into the Texas dark, he kept it to himself for a very long time. The account he eventually gave and the account the official record had already given were not accounts that could be reconciled. One of them described weather balloon remnants on a rancher's pasture, recovered by personnel who initially overclaimed what they had found, corrected by the appropriate authority within hours, and filed as a resolved matter that July. The other described something else, something that had been worth substituting, worth correcting, worth sending an intelligence officer back to his base without the debris he had come to Fort Worth carrying, and worth 30 years of institutional silence on his part, before he sat down with a researcher and began, for the first time, to say what he actually believed he had seen. The gap between those two accounts is the space the Roswell case has occupied ever since, not resolved in favor of one version or the other, not closed by any document that has entered the public record, not bridged by any testimony that has been able to satisfy both the official account and the witness accounts at the same time. The aircraft carried Marcel west through the Texas night, toward New Mexico, toward Roswell, toward the base that had sent him to the Foster Ranch, and would receive him back now without the material he had gone to collect. The story was already finished, as far as the official record was concerned. The wire services had the new version. The photographs existed. Newton had given his identification. General Ramey had convened and closed the press conference, and the flying disc press release had been replaced in the record by the weather balloon explanation that would stand as the institutional answer to anyone who asked. Marcel carried his own answer privately, in the dark, across the miles between Fort Worth and Roswell, as the correction was already running through teletype machines in news bureaus across the country. The new version of the story, printing itself out, letter by letter, in the early hours of July 9th, 1947, settling the question for everyone who had not been in that field, and for everyone who had not been in that office, and for everyone who had not held the material in their hands on both occasions and noticed what was different. Jesse Marcel Sr. sat at a table in Houma, Louisiana, in 1978, his hands resting flat on the surface in front of him, and after 30 years of saying nothing to anyone outside his family about what he had found on a ranch in New Mexico in the summer of 1947, he began to speak. Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist who had spent years tracking down individuals connected to the incident through military records and public archives, had located Marcel through a combination of document research and a tip passed through a mutual contact. He had driven to Louisiana with a recorder. Marcel, who was 63 years old that year and had retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, did not need much persuading. The 30 years of quiet, it appeared, had not been comfortable. What he had carried across those decades, he would later tell Friedman, was not a burden of extraordinary weight, so much as the persistent low friction of knowing that the official account and his own direct experience of the materials did not match, and that he had been present at the moment the discrepancy was made official. The material he described was unlike anything in his experience as a military intelligence officer. He had handled wreckage. He knew what a weather balloon looked like when it came apart on the ground. He knew radar reflector targets, the balsa wood and foil assemblies that were common equipment in the late 1940s, and he knew what they felt like when handled and what they looked like after a period of time on the desert floor. What he had gathered from the Foster Ranch, he told Friedman, was none of those things. The foil-like substance was his first detailed description. It was thin, lighter than the thinnest sheet metal he had encountered, and when crumpled in the hand, as he had crumpled it, and as he had watched others crumple it, it returned to its original shape without crease or distortion. He had tried to dent it. He had pressed it against a surface and brought weight against it. The material simply resumed its form. He described this not with excitement, but with the specific technical frustration of a man trying to account for something he had no category for. The words he used were the words of someone who had spent his professional life inside categories and found, on that one morning in 1947, that a category was missing. There were beams as well. He described them as small, lightweight I-beams, not large structural members but narrow pieces, the dimensions of a hand, and along their inner surfaces there were markings. Marcel did not call them writing. he did not claim to have understood them as language. They were geometric, he said, arranged in a pattern, in a color he described as purplish or pinkish, and pressed or embedded into the material rather than painted on its surface. He had not seen anything like them in 30 years of subsequent service, and in 30 years of subsequent thinking about what they might have been. He maintained, until his death in 1986, that the material shown in the photographs taken at General Ramey's office in Fort Worth was not the material he had carried from the Foster Ranch. He said this without anger in Friedman's account of the interview, and without apparent bitterness. He said it the way a person states a fact they have long since made peace with, a fact they do not expect to be resolved, that they no longer require to be resolved, but that they are not willing to quietly rescind simply because the official version requires them to. Jesse Marcel Jr. was 11 years old on the night his father came home. The date was in the early hours of July 8th, 1947, and his father had woken him and his mother and brought them to the kitchen table to show them what he had gathered from the Foster Ranch before his drive to Fort Worth the following morning. The boy examined the pieces spread across the table surface. He was young, and his memory of the event would be colored by the decades between the night itself and the moment he first spoke publicly about it. But the account he gave was specific in ways that proved durable across multiple tellings, separated by years. He described the I-beam pieces. He was precise about their dimensions, consistent in his descriptions of the markings, and specific about the quality of the material, the lightness of it, the structural integrity of it relative to its weight. He held the pieces, he said, in the way a boy holds something his father has brought home from a place he cannot visit, turning them in the light of the kitchen, and what he remembered was not excitement, but curiosity, the particular curiosity of examining an object that did not fit any category he had available to him at 11 years old or at any age thereafter. Jesse Marcel Jr. became a medical doctor and served as an Army helicopter pilot. He gave interviews, he wrote a book, he spoke at conferences and submitted to documentary filmmakers, and answered the same questions across the last decades of his life with the same patience his father had brought to the kitchen table in Huma in 1978. He never materially altered his account. The markings were purplish pink. The beams were small. The foil returned to its shape. He maintained this publicly and on the record until his death in 2013. 2 generations of the same family, across 7 decades, giving accounts that did not contradict each other in any significant detail. That is what the record shows. It does not resolve the question of what the material was. The Marcel accounts establish that 2 people, a military intelligence officer and his son, handled something at the kitchen table in Roswell in the early hours of July 8, 1947, and found it unusual. They do not establish on their own what the material's origin was. What they do establish, with some consistency and across a significant span of time, is that the description the Marcels gave did not match the description of the material displayed in General Ramey's office later that same day, and that Jesse Marcel Sr. knew that and said so, and never changed his position on it. The roads north of Roswell in the days following the initial report were not open in the way they usually were. Multiple civilian residents of the Corona area and the wider Lincoln County region reported the same general experience independently. Military vehicles on the unpaved roads leading toward the Foster Ranch area, uniformed soldiers stationed at points along those roads, and the consistent direction to turn back and proceed no further. The accounts varied in their specific details, the precise location of the blockades, the number of vehicles present, the manner in which the soldiers delivered their instructions, but the core description was consistent. Something was happening in the pasture land north of town, and the roads into that area were closed. The Air Force's own 1994 report, which concluded that the recovered debris was most probably the remains of a Project Mogul balloon train, acknowledged that a significant military retrieval operation had indeed occurred in the vicinity of the Foster Ranch in early July 1947. The Corden accounts were not dismissed. The 1994 report's explanation was that the secrecy was warranted by the classified nature of Project Mogul itself, that soldiers blocking roads and civilians being turned back were simply the ordinary security posture of an operation retrieving highly classified equipment. The accounts of the Cordons, in other words, were consistent with both explanations. Either the military was retrieving the wreckage of a classified balloon program under the ordinary protocols for such operations, or the military was retrieving something else under extraordinary protocols designed to restrict observation and prevent the nature of the retrieval from becoming known. The record does not determine which of those explanations is correct. What the record does establish is that the Cordons were real, that multiple civilian witnesses reported them independently, and that the Air Force itself did not dispute that a large-scale military ground operation took place in the area. The question that the Corden accounts leave open is not whether the operation happened, but what the operation was securing. Among the residents who observed or heard accounts of the road closures in those days were individuals who reported additional details: the sweep of personnel across the debris field, the systematic nature of the collection, the removal of material by vehicle over a period of days rather than hours. These accounts are harder to evaluate than the Corden reports because the Corden reports are confirmed in outline by the Air Force's own documentation, while the debris sweep accounts exist primarily in personal testimony collected decades later. What can be said is that the accounts accumulated across the interviews conducted by researchers beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1990s into a consistent pattern. Military personnel moving methodically through an area of rangeland, collecting material from the ground, and leaving the area clear. Whether the material being collected was balloon debris under a classified program or something the collectors themselves had not encountered before is a question those accounts cannot answer. They can only report what was observed from the perimeter, a systematic operation conducted by uniformed military personnel on ground that had been closed to civilian access. Walter Haut spent most of his adult life in Roswell. He had been 25 years old in the summer of 1947, a first lieutenant assigned as public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, and on the morning of July 8th he had sat at a typewriter and produced the press release that announced the recovery of a flying disc. He issued it under the authority of Colonel Blanchard. It went out over the wire services. The correction followed within hours, and for most of the decades that followed, Haut occupied a complicated position in the landscape of Roswell testimony. The man who had written the original announcement, who acknowledged doing so, who helped found the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell in the early 1990s, and who nonetheless spoke cautiously in interviews and did not claim personal knowledge of anything more dramatic than the press release itself. He was careful. He was consistent in that carefulness across many interviews and many years. He said he had typed what he was told to type. He said he had issued a press release he had not written the content of. He said he did not know what the recovered material was. He said this to journalists and researchers and documentary crews across 50 years. and his carefulness was noted by everyone who spoke to him as something that felt deliberate rather than evasive. The carefulness of a man who had decided precisely where the boundary of what he would say publicly was located, and who kept to it. He died in 2005. In the period after his death, a sealed affidavit was opened. It had been prepared, according to those who administered it, in the early 2000s, and Hott had stipulated that it should remain sealed until after his death. The affidavit, when opened, contained claims significantly more dramatic than anything Hott had said publicly in life. He described in the affidavit having been present at a meeting on the morning of July 8, 1947, at which Colonel Blanchard showed the assembled officers a craft, not debris, but a craft that had been recovered near the Foster Ranch. He described the craft as oval, perhaps 4 to 5 meters in length. He described bodies associated with it, small in stature, with disproportionately large heads. He described having seen these things directly. The affidavit was witnessed and notarized and carries the legal weight of a sworn statement. It also cannot be cross-examined. Hott was not available to be questioned about the specifics of what he had written, to account for the distance between his decades of careful public reticence and the dramatic private claims in the document, or to explain why the account he had kept private for the whole of his public life was so different from the one he had maintained across 50 years of interviews. He had made a decision, in preparing the affidavit, that what he had seen and what he had chosen to say publicly were 2 different registers, and the document he left behind sits at the point where those 2 registers met, at the very end of his life, in a sealed envelope in a drawer. The affidavit is part of the record. It is the sworn statement of a named individual who was present at Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947 and held a specific official role. It is also, by the nature of sealed posthumous documents, a statement that exists outside the ordinary processes of verification and challenge. What is known is that Walter Haut wrote it, had it witnessed, and sealed it. What it describes is not corroborated by any other surviving first-hand account from an individual of comparable position and access. The record holds the affidavit, as it holds everything else in this case, as a real document with a real author in a landscape of real questions that have not been resolved. George Wilcox was the sheriff of Chavez County in the summer of 1947, and he received Mac Brazel's initial report on July 7th and made the telephone call to Roswell Army Airfield that brought the formal military response into motion. He was one of the earliest civilian figures to be drawn into the incident at an official level, and he said almost nothing about it for the rest of his life. His silence was different from Marcel's silence in character. Marcel's silence, as Marcel himself described it, was the silence of a man who had made a decision to stay within the bounds of what he had been instructed not to discuss, and who had maintained that boundary not out of fear, but out of a combination of military discipline and uncertainty about what purpose speaking would serve. Wilcox's silence, in the account given by his family members in interviews conducted decades later, was different in quality. His granddaughter, in testimony collected by researchers in the 1990s, described him as a man who had been frightened, who had spoken privately to family about having received a warning from military personnel shortly after the incident, a warning about the consequences of speaking publicly about what he had seen or heard. No documentary record of any such warning has been made public. The family accounts exist as family accounts, reported across the years between the incident and the interviews, passed through the filter of memory and family narrative, and the particular way that significant events are carried inside families across generations. The granddaughter's account is specific. She recalled her grandmother telling her that a military officer had come to the house, that words had been exchanged that frightened both her grandparents, and that George Wilcox had afterwards been unwilling to discuss the matter at all. Whether this account reflects something that actually happened to Wilcox and his wife in the days following July 7th, 1947, or whether it reflects the way a family constructed meaning around a sheriff's long silence, cannot be established from the available record. What is established is that Wilcox, who held an elected public office and had every conventional civic reason to speak openly about a notable local event, did not speak openly about it. He served out his term. He did not seek re-election. He died in 1961 without leaving any written account of what he had heard from Brazel at the counter of the Chavez County Sheriff's Office on the afternoon of July 7th, or what he had heard from the military after that phone call was made. The silence of public officials is not by itself evidence of anything in particular. Elected officials keep confidences. Law enforcement officers are often discreet about the details of cases that involve the military or federal agencies. The silence of one sheriff in one county in New Mexico in 1947 is in isolation unremarkable. What makes Wilcox's silence notable is the context in which it sat. The abrupt retraction of the flying disc press release, the military cordons on the roads, the systematic retrieval operation, the sealed affidavit of Walter Haut, and the 30 years of private carrying that Jesse Marcel Sr. finally set down on a table in Louisiana in 1978. Each of those pieces of context does not explain the others. Together they form the landscape of a story that from the beginning had more silence in it than the official account required. The testimony that accumulated across the decades following the incident had a particular texture to it. It was not testimony that arrived in a rush in the weeks or months after July 1947. It arrived slowly across years and decades, beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s and 1990s, as researchers tracked down individuals who had been young in the summer of 1947 and were now elderly, who had spent their working lives inside or adjacent to the military and were now retired, and who had carried their accounts of what they saw or heard without speaking about them publicly, because they said in various formulations across various interviews they had been told not to. The consistent element in those accounts of silence is not fear in any dramatic sense. It is something more mundane, the ordinary institutional pressure of having been a junior officer or a civilian contractor or a local resident who encountered something connected to a military operation, receiving an instruction from someone in a position of authority to keep the matter private, and then keeping it private for 30 years because that was what was asked, and because nothing in daily life subsequently created an occasion to revisit the question. The extraordinary part of those accounts is not the content of what the witnesses said they saw. The extraordinary part is the duration of the quiet, the decades across which a collection of individuals in a small city in New Mexico carried their private versions of a summer week in 1947 without comparing notes, without coordinating, and arrived when researchers finally began asking systematic questions at accounts that overlapped in their general outlines more than random independent recollection would be expected to produce. That consistency is itself something the record cannot fully explain. It could mean the consistent accounts describe something real. It could mean the consistent accounts were shaped over decades by the same local narrative that the community had gradually assembled from fragments, each witness's memory, partly their own, and partly the story they had heard told around them across 30 years. Memory research conducted since the 1970s has established that long-term recollection of specific events, particularly events mediated through significant emotional or social context, is substantially more malleable than the individual reporting the memory generally believes it to be. What was seen, and what was heard, and what was told, and what was read over 30 years can arrive at a single recall point as an apparently unified memory of something experienced directly. That is not a dismissal of the witnesses. It is a statement about the nature of memory as the record of human psychology has established it. The Marcel family accounts, which are the most frequently cited because they come from individuals of clear professional standing who handled the material directly, are the strongest in the body of testimony, precisely because they were given relatively early. Jesse Marcel Sr. in 1978, Jesse Marcel Jr. thereafter, and because they were given by individuals who had some professional basis for evaluating what they handled. The accounts that accumulated later, from individuals further from the core events, are harder to hold with the same confidence, not because the witnesses were dishonest, but because the conditions under which the memories were preserved and reported do not allow the same degree of confidence in their accuracy. The record holds all of it. The early Marcel accounts and the later accumulated testimony. The military cordon reports that the Air Force itself acknowledged, and the sealed Hout affidavit that cannot be verified, the sheriff's lifetime of silence, and his family's account of why. It holds these things together in the same archive, and the archive does not sort them by reliability or rank them by persuasiveness. It simply holds them the way a sealed room holds whatever was placed inside it before the door was closed. Present, real, in the sense that documents and statements and transcribed interviews are real, and awaiting a standard of verification that the available evidence has not yet supplied. Stanton Friedman, whose 1978 interview with Marcel Sr. set the modern research process into motion, spent the rest of his professional life inside this landscape of testimony and documentation. He was a methodical researcher, careful about sourcing, and he made arguments he believed the evidence supported rather than claims he knew the evidence did not reach. He located and interviewed more than 100 witnesses over the decades. He tracked documents through the Freedom of Information Act process. He published his findings and submitted them to scrutiny. He was not a credulous man, and he was not a careless one. What he could not do, what no researcher working within the available evidence could do, was close the gap between what the witnesses described and what the documents confirmed, between the account of the materials Jesse Marcel Sr. gave in Louisiana in 1978 and the photographs taken in General Ramey's office that the Air Force presented as the record of what was recovered. That gap is the persistent feature of the Roswell witness body, not the dramatic claims, not the bodies, not the extraordinary elements that accumulated in later testimony from sources further from the events. Those elements push against the evidentiary boundary and cannot be confirmed. The persistent feature is simpler and more durable. It is the gap between what the official record says was recovered on the Foster Ranch in July 1947 and what the individuals who handled the material say they handled. That gap is not closed by the Air Force reports. It is not closed by the Project Mogul explanation, which accounts for the classified nature of the recovery operation, but does not fully account for the properties of the material as the Marcels described them. It is not closed by the passage of time. It is instead closed by the passage of time, exactly the kind of gap that produces the long, slow, patient accumulation of testimony that the Roswell record became across the second half of the 20th century. people who handled something unusual or were present at a military operation whose scope seemed disproportionate to its stated purpose, or worked at an installation where something was kept quiet that the ordinary protocols of the time did not require to be kept quiet, and who carried those experiences across the years and decades, the way people carry things they have no frame for, waiting for a context in which the experience might finally make sense. For Jesse Marcel Sr., sitting at the table in Huma in 1978, the context arrived 30 years late, and in the form of a nuclear physicist with a tape recorder. For his son, it arrived in the form of a public conversation that lasted the rest of his life. For the Lincoln County residents who watched military vehicles block the roads north of town in July 1947, it arrived in the form of researchers who came asking questions decades after the military vehicles were gone and the roads were open again. For Walter Hott, it arrived in the form of a sealed envelope and the understanding that whatever he chose to say would be said after the period in which it could be questioned had passed. The sealed envelope itself is a particular kind of document. It is a decision made at the end of a life about what to carry publicly and what to carry privately, and where, finally, to put the private thing down. Hott made that decision, had the document witnessed, and left it in the care of people who would know when to open it. The years between his death and the opening of the affidavit, the time during which the envelope sat in a drawer in a lawyer's office or a safe or wherever sealed documents are kept while their authors are still living, those years were years during which the document existed but said nothing, held its contents in the dark, waited. The room around a sealed document is always quiet. The contents do not change. The questions the document raises, once opened, are the same questions they would have been if it had been opened the day it was sealed, but the person who could have answered them is no longer present, and the questions must be held instead, as all the questions in the Roswell record must eventually be held. In the particular patience of the archive, there is a quality to the body of Roswell testimony that distinguishes it from the testimony in most historical cases of comparable age. Most events from 1947 have been absorbed into the settled record. The witnesses have died, the documents have been declassified or destroyed, the official account has been accepted or revised, and the case has reached whatever resolution the available evidence permitted. The Roswell case has not settled in that way. The witnesses died across the decades from the 1960s through the 2010, each one carrying their account to a final interview or a sealed document or an unrecorded conversation with a family member, and the record they left behind did not resolve the question they had carried. It simply transferred the question to the archive, where it sits alongside the documents and the absence of documents and the accounts of military cordons and the photographs taken in General Ramey's office on the afternoon of July 8, 1947, in which Jesse Marcel Sr. knelt beside material he later said was not the material he had brought from the Foster Ranch. That photograph is still there. The original negative is held in a collection at the University of Texas at Arlington. Researchers have examined it with digital enhancement technology, looking for text in a document that General Ramey is holding in his right hand in the image, looking for words that might indicate what Ramey knew that afternoon about what had been recovered and what the plan for communicating about it was. The text, if it can be fully recovered and read, has not yet yielded a definitive transcription. The photograph exists, the document in Ramey's hand exists within it, and the words on the document remain partially legible, partially not, depending on the method of analysis and the resolution of the available scans, That too is the texture of the Roswell record. Not closed, not resolved, not entirely legible, held in the permanent condition of a case whose evidence has not been sufficient to confirm the extraordinary explanation and has not been sufficient to fully satisfy the ordinary one, and whose witnesses, across 7 decades of dying, left behind not a resolution, but a growing archive of sealed things, written in the late hours of long lives, waiting in the quiet for a clarity that the documents so far have not provided. Walter Haut's affidavit sits in that archive. It is real. It is the statement of a man who was there. What it describes cannot be verified by any record presently available to researchers, and its author left the world in the same year it was opened, leaving the claims inside it to rest in the same unresolved state as everything else the case has carried across the decades, present, documented, held in the patient dark of the archive, where sealed things wait in the stillness for whoever comes next to ask the question again. A long balloon train was being laid out on the flight line at Alamogordo Army Airfield in the early morning of spring 1947, its sections unrolled across the pale concrete in the cool air before the desert heat arrived. Technicians from New York University moved along its length without speaking much, checking connections between neoprene balloon clusters and the instrument packages suspended between them. The foil-covered radar reflector targets caught what light there was, bright and briefly animal in the low sun, then settled again as they were set flat against the ground. The people working on this equipment had been cleared for their specific tasks. Most of them had not been cleared for the purpose of the task itself. That distinction between what the technicians were permitted to do and what they were permitted to know ran through the entirety of Project Mogul from its inception. The program had been authorized at the highest levels of the Army Air Forces as a response to a problem that did not yet have a solution: how to detect a Soviet nuclear test from American soil across the enormous distances involved without the Soviets knowing the detection was taking place. The answer, proposed by Columbia University acoustics researcher Maurice Ewing, rested on a property of the upper atmosphere, a layer of air at a particular altitude where temperature and pressure combined to channel acoustic energy across very long distances. A balloon train capable of reaching and remaining at that altitude, carrying acoustic sensors, could theoretically listen for the pressure waves produced by a distant nuclear detonation. The program was classified at the highest available level. Its name was not used in any communication that was not itself fully secured. And when its equipment came down on a ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, in the late spring of 1947, no one standing near the debris on the ground had been cleared to know what it was or where it came from. This is the explanation the Air Force offered in 1994 in a formal report commissioned by the Secretary of the Air Force in response to renewed congressional and public interest in the Roswell incident. The report was a substantial document, not a press release or a denial. It ran to hundreds of pages and drew on declassified records, interview transcripts, and technical specifications for Project Mogul equipment. Its central argument was specific, that the debris field on the Foster Ranch was most probably the remains of New York University Flight 4, a Mogul balloon train launched from Alamogordo on June 4, 1947, whose final position could not be confirmed from the tracking records, but whose calculated trajectory carried it in the general direction of Lincoln County. The radar reflector targets in the Mogul assembly were built on balsa wood frames covered in aluminum foil, reinforced with tape, printed with geometric symbols in a pinkish-violet ink, and suspended between balloon clusters by nylon cord and light stainless steel wire. The Air Force report noted that these materials, described by a rancher, unfamiliar with classified balloon technology, would present as unusually lightweight material that did not behave like ordinary foil, tape printed with unfamiliar markings, and thin structural members that were resistant to ordinary bending. The report proposed that this ordinary origin for unusual materials had been precisely the thing that made the debris seem so strange. The 1994 report was prepared under the direction of Colonel Richard Weaver and researcher James McAndrew. It represented the first formal effort by the Air Force to engage with the substance of Roswell claims in a document meant to be publicly read and assessed rather than simply issued as a denial. That distinction matters when reading it. The report did not argue that nothing had happened. It argued with documents and diagrams that a specific thing had happened, a classified balloon program, a debris field, an understandable overreaction to unfamiliar material, and that the layers of subsequent secrecy had been products of that classification, not of something more. Project Mogul itself was real. That is not in dispute. The program is fully documented in declassified Air Force and academic records, and its technical ambition was genuine and considerable. The balloon trains launched under its early flights were among the largest unmanned atmospheric platforms assembled to that point in the history of American aerospace development, some of them more than 600 feet from the first balloon to the last instrument package, requiring teams of technicians to lay out and prepare on a flat surface before inflation. The radar reflectors incorporated in the early flights were purchased commercially from a toy manufacturer in New York, which accounts for the patterned tape. It was decorative material applied at the factory for reasons unrelated to Mogul, used because it was available, and the project was working quickly under classified conditions without established supply chains. A technician in 1947, asked to describe what the tape looked like, might reasonably use the word symbols. Someone who had never seen a radar reflector target might describe the foil backing as a material that held its shape in an unusual way and caught light differently from ordinary aluminium. The argument has a logical coherence that rewards reading carefully. Its weakness is in the specific flight record. New York University Flight 4 was launched on June 4th, 1947. The tracking data for that flight was incomplete at the time and remains incomplete in the declassified record. The Air Force report acknowledged this gap and worked from the available data to construct a trajectory that was plausible but not confirmed. The rancher who found the debris reported it in early July, describing material scattered across a field roughly 3/4 of a mile long. The timeline is consistent with Flight 4. If the balloon train descended somewhere in that window, the spatial correspondence is consistent if the tracking gap is filled with a reasonable interpolation. Neither the timeline nor the spatial correspondence is established with the kind of documentary precision that would close the case entirely. The critics of the Mogul explanation have pressed on precisely this point for 30 years. The trajectory of Flight 4 was reconstructed, not recorded. The case for Mogul rests on what would have to be true for the explanation to work, which is a different kind of evidence from what is shown on a dated chart with a confirmed ground track. The 1994 report was thorough and in several places genuinely illuminating. It was not, even on its own terms, a final documentary resolution. 3 years after the first report, the Air Force issued a second, published in 1997, entitled simply Case Closed. It addressed an element the 1994 report had not: the accounts of witnesses who described seeing not just debris, but bodies. The 1994 report had confined itself to the debris field evidence, leaving the body accounts for a separate analysis. The 1997 report provided one. Its argument was that the accounts of small, pale, humanoid figures seen near a crash site in the summer of 1947 were most probably distorted memories of anthropomorphic crash test dummies deployed in a later Air Force program called Project High Dive. Project High Dive was a real program. It ran from the mid-1950s through the early 1960s, and its purpose was to test parachute recovery systems that might eventually be used to retrieve human pilots from extreme altitudes. The dummies used in High Dive were life-sized, human-proportioned, and notably pale in appearance. They were dropped from high-altitude balloons over remote desert terrain in the southwest, and their recovery involved teams of Air Force personnel arriving at remote landing sites in military vehicles. A witness who saw a high dive recovery operation from a distance, the 1997 report suggested, might later misremember it as having occurred in 1947 rather than 1954 or 1956, and might describe the pale, jointed dummies in language that, processed through decades of popular culture, came out sounding like descriptions of non-human bodies. The problem with this argument was identified immediately by both academic historians and researchers with no particular stake in the extraterrestrial interpretation. Project High Dive did not begin until 1954. The 1947 incident it was offered to explain predates the program by 7 years. Memory compression, the psychological phenomenon in which separate events collapse into a single remembered narrative over long periods, is a documented and genuine mechanism, but the Air Force report was not arguing for a modest temporal compression of a few months or a year or two. It was arguing for a compression of 7 years or more across witnesses who were describing events that would have been notably unusual and memorable at the time they occurred, and whose accounts were in several cases given to researchers before Project High Dive had become widely known to the public. The 1997 report's reception among professional historians of the early Cold War was not warm. The body of scholarship that engages seriously with government secrecy programs from this period, the programs that are now fully documented, that did involve real experiments on real people without their knowledge, that were hidden for decades, tends towards skepticism when an official explanation introduces a temporal gap and then dismisses the gap as a function of imperfect memory. The critique was not that the body accounts were necessarily accurate. It was that the explanation offered for them was not historically rigorous. A program that began in 1954 cannot explain 1947 sightings on the basis of memory compression alone without additional evidence that the specific witnesses had specific access to the later program, had encountered the dummies, and had reason to place those memories 7 years earlier. The Air Force stood by the 1997 report. It has not issued a third. In the same period that the Air Force was completing its analyses, a separate institutional inquiry was underway through a different channel. Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, responding to constituent interest and his own stated frustration with what he described as bureaucratic non-responsiveness from the Department of Defense, requested that the General Accounting Office conduct a formal audit of government records related to the Roswell incident. The GAO undertook that audit and released its findings in 1995. Most of what the GAO found was administrative, record retention schedules, file catalogs, the paper infrastructure of mid-century military administration, but one paragraph in the report drew attention that has not entirely faded in the 30 years since it was published. Outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield covering the period from October 1946 through December 1949 had been destroyed. The destruction had taken place without proper authorization under the applicable record retention regulations. The GAO's report noted this fact in the precise bureaucratic language appropriate to an accounting document, not as an allegation, not as a finding of wrongdoing, but as a documented state of the record. The messages were gone. The authorization required to destroy them had not been obtained. The report did not name who had ordered the destruction, or when, or what the messages contained. It simply noted the gap where the record should be, and was not. That gap sits in the documentary landscape of Roswell, like the space in a shelf where a volume has been removed. The shelf is otherwise intact. The books on either side are present and labeled. The record of outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield exists for the periods before and after this window. The record for the years that include July 1947 and the months that follow it is gone, destroyed, at some point, without the authorization that destruction required. The Air Force's response to the GAO finding was that the destruction was most likely inadvertent, a housekeeping error rather than a deliberate act. That explanation is possible. It is also not provable in either direction. What can be said, accurately and specifically, is that the General Accounting Office found that the relevant records had been destroyed, and that the destruction had been unauthorized, and that no one has produced a satisfactory account of when or why it happened. The question of what to do with an absence in an archive is genuinely difficult, and historians who work seriously with government records face it regularly. Missing documents can mean many things. They can mean nothing was ever filed. They can mean ordinary administrative neglect. They can mean fire, flood, or the mundane degradation of physical media over decades. They can mean, in some cases, deliberate removal. The evidentiary problem is that all of these explanations look identical from the outside: an absence, and then a silence where the explanation should be. The GAO finding does not confirm that the Roswell Army Airfield messages were removed to protect a secret. It confirms only that they were destroyed without authorization. Both readings are consistent with that fact. Neither reading is excluded by it. This is the quality that distinguishes the Roswell documentary record from the cleaner archival puzzles that historians prefer. Most of the time, when a government program is eventually fully disclosed, the absence of earlier records can be accounted for by the administrative history of the classification itself. A single agency held the files. A single declassification review released them, and the apparent gaps turn out to be artifacts of the review process rather than holes in the underlying record. The Roswell record does not behave this way. Its gaps are scattered across multiple agencies and multiple decades. The Air Force files for the relevant period at Roswell were destroyed. The Project Blue Book files at the National Archives contain no case file for the incident. The FBI files that have been released through FOIA contain a single teletype from the Dallas field office dated July 8, 1947, relaying the weather balloon explanation, but no subsequent investigation material. Each of these absences has an official explanation. Each of those explanations is partial. Project Blue Book operated as the Air Force's formal UFO investigation program from 1952 until its closure in 1969. Its files are held at the National Archives, and they have been substantially declassified. The collection runs to thousands of case files, indexed by date, location, and case number, with witness statements, investigative notes, and final classifications for each reported incident. The collection is large enough to take days to review in full, and researchers who have done so have documented its contents in considerable detail. What those researchers consistently report is that there is no Roswell case file in the Project Blue Book collection. The Air Force's explanation for this absence is straightforward. The Roswell incident was resolved in July 1947, 5 years before Project Blue Book was established, and a case resolved before the program existed would not have generated a Blue Book file. This is logically coherent. It is also the case that Project Blue Book retroactively cataloged a number of pre-1952 incidents that were considered relevant to its investigation. The 1947 Kenneth Arnold sighting over the Cascade Mountains, which is generally considered the beginning of the modern flying saucer era, appears in the Blue Book files. Several other 1947 incidents appear as well. The Roswell incident does not. The Air Force attribute the absence to the case having been resolved. Proponents of further investigation argue that the absence reflects deliberate exclusion. The documented fact is simply that the file is not there, in a collection where comparable incidents from the same period are present. That fact does not confirm either interpretation. It is exactly as ambiguous as it appears. There is a category of evidence in the Roswell record that is neither testimony nor documentation, but something in between: the physical characteristics of the radar reflector targets used in Project Mogul as described in technical specifications, set against the physical characteristics of the Foster Ranch debris as described by witnesses. The 1994 Air Force report spent considerable effort on this comparison, and the comparison is worth following in its own right. The Mogul radar reflectors were built from balsa wood sticks, aluminium foil, and patterned tape. Balsa wood is extremely light, splits with reasonable ease under pressure, and does not cut cleanly. Aluminium foil is light, deforms easily under handling, and tends to stay deformed. It does not spring back to its original shape after crumpling. The tape used on the early Mogul reflectors was manufactured by a company in New York that produced novelty products, and the patterns printed on it included geometric designs in a pinkish violet ink. Witnesses who handled the Foster Ranch debris described material that could not be cut or burned, that sprang back to its original shape after crumpling, and that was notably strong for its weight. They described markings resembling unfamiliar writing. They described structural members that could not be bent or broken by ordinary hand pressure. The balsa wood and foil description in the Mogul specifications does not map easily onto the physical properties reported by the witnesses, not because the witnesses are necessarily accurate, but because balsa wood and aluminium foil do not behave the way the witnesses consistently described. Balsa breaks. Foil does not spring back. The 1994 Air Force report acknowledged this discrepancy in a qualified way by noting that memory over long periods is imperfect, and that witnesses recounting their experiences after 30 or more years may be working partly from the original experience and partly from subsequent cultural material. This is a legitimate methodological point. It is also not entirely satisfying as a reconciliation of the specific discrepancies involved. A material that springs back to its original shape after crumpling is a property distinctive enough that it would be difficult to misremember as a property of ordinary aluminium foil, regardless of how much time has passed. This is the quality of the evidentiary problem at the center of the Roswell record, not a clean confrontation between a documented fact and a fabrication, but a series of partial correspondences and partial mismatches that resolve differently depending on how much weight is given to witness memory, technical specification, and the limits of both. The 1994 report proposed a specific explanation that is consistent with a documented program and a plausible trajectory. The physical description provided by the witnesses is not fully consistent with the materials in that explanation. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The history of how the government handled the immediate aftermath of the Foster Ranch debris report contributes its own layer to this difficulty. The press release of July 8, 1947, issued by the Roswell Army Airfield Public Information Office, used the words flying disc. That language was not casual. In the institutional context of mid-1947, with the Kenneth Arnold sighting, only weeks in the past and flying disc reports accumulating across the country, the phrase carried a specific meaning and generated a specific public response. It moved on wire services within hours. It ran in afternoon newspapers. It was on radio broadcasts before the day was out. The retraction, issued from Fort Worth the same afternoon, used the phrase weather balloon. The gap between those two official statements, hours not days, has never been explained in terms of a specific institutional decision trail. Who made the call to issue the first release? Who made the call to retract it? What communication passed between Roswell Army Airfield and Fort Worth in the hours between those two statements? The documents that would answer these questions are among those that are no longer available. Colonel William Blanchard, who authorized the original press release, went on to become a 4-star general and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Air Force before his death in 1966. His career after 1947 was one of continuous elevation, a trajectory that sits awkwardly alongside the Air Force's later characterization of the July 8th press release as an error made by inexperienced personnel. Blanchard was not inexperienced. He commanded the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear-capable strike force in the world at that point in history, and he had been entrusted with its operation because his judgment was considered reliable at the highest levels of the post-war Air Force. The question the record leaves open is not whether Blanchard was capable of error. Everyone is capable of error. The question is whether an officer of that experience and that institutional position would authorize a press release using specific and nationally charged language without some basis for the characterization it contained, and the record, in the absence of the relevant outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield, does not answer that question. The documentary landscape here has a particular texture that is worth staying with for a moment. Each individual element of the official explanation has something to recommend it. Project Mogul was real, classified, and operating in New Mexico in the spring of 1947. Its equipment did include materials that could appear unusual to someone unfamiliar with it. The timeline of Flight 4 is not incompatible with the Foster Ranch debris field, even if it is not confirmed by a continuous tracking record. The pressure to issue and then immediately retract a public statement makes institutional sense if the original statement accidentally disclosed a classified program. Taken together, these elements make a coherent case. The difficulty is that each element also has a gap in it, and the gaps do not run in the same direction. The trajectory of Flight 4 is reconstructed, not documented. The physical properties of Mogul materials do not match the witness descriptions in at least one important respect. The 1997 explanation for the body accounts introduced a 7-year temporal discrepancy it attributed to memory compression without supporting evidence. The outgoing messages that would show what Roswell Army Airfield communicated to higher command in the week of July 7th are gone. The Project Blue Book collection, which contains comparable 1947 cases, does not contain this one. An institutional explanation assembled from reconstructed trajectories, acknowledged memory imperfection, and missing documentation is not the same as an institutional explanation assembled from documentary evidence. The former is consistent with the available facts. The latter would close the case. What exists is the former. Researchers who have spent careers in the classified program history of the early Cold War, people who have worked the FOIA process for decades on programs far more thoroughly documented than Mogul, tend to describe the Roswell record as unusual in a specific way. It is not unusual for classified programs to leave evidentiary gaps. Classification produces gaps as a matter of design. What is unusual is the pattern of gaps in this particular record: the destroyed outgoing messages, the absent Blue Book case file, the unconfirmed Flight 4 trajectory, the temporal mismatch in the 1997 body account explanation. Each gap has an innocuous explanation, all of them together, clustering around the same 2 weeks in July 1947, produce a record that looks different from what a simple administrative accident would produce. That observation is not a conclusion. It is a description of what the record looks like when all of its elements are laid beside each other in the order they occupy in the archive. The record shows a real event, a debris field, a military response, a press release, a retraction, and it shows a series of subsequent efforts to explain that event by reference to a classified program whose documentation is itself partial. The record does not show in any surviving document or confirmed provenance what the debris actually was. It shows what was found, what was said about it officially, what was said about it later officially, what is missing from the files, and where the explanation holds and where it does not quite close. That is a genuinely unusual archival condition to be in. It is not the same as proof of anything beyond what the documents show, but it is also not the same as a resolved case. The Air Force titled its 1997 report "Case Closed." The archival record has not confirmed that judgment, and the researchers who work within it have not agreed. The case remains in the condition it has occupied since 1994, officially explained, with explanations that contain acknowledged gaps against a documentary background that includes significant authorized and unauthorized absences. The Mogul balloon trains that flew from Alamogordo in the spring and summer of 1947 were eventually succeeded by programs with better tracking and more reliable equipment. Project Mogul itself was wound down as other detection methods became more reliable and as the program's classified status created more operational friction than its results justified. The acoustic detection layer it was designed to exploit turned out to be less consistent and less operationally useful than Ewing had hoped. By the early 1950s, the program had effectively ended, its records archived, its equipment dispersed, its purpose reassigned to other platforms. The technicians who had laid out those long balloon trains in the early morning at Alamogordo moved on to other work. Some of them may have been aware, later, that one of their flights had become the center of an enduring public controversy. The documentary record does not record their views on the subject. What the documentary record does preserve is the shape of the question. A debris field was found on a ranch in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. The military responded quickly, cordoned the area, recovered the material, and issued a statement describing it as a flying disc before issuing a correction within hours. The records of outgoing messages from the relevant base for that period were subsequently destroyed without authorization. A formal explanation was offered nearly 50 years later, referencing a classified program whose specific flight documentation is incomplete. A second formal explanation was offered 3 years after that, invoking a program that began 7 years after the event it was meant to explain. The body of available documentation, taken in full, is consistent with the Project Mogul explanation and does not confirm it. The National Archives holds the Project Blue Book case files in document boxes, labeled by year and incident number, arranged on shelves in the reading room, available to researchers with appropriate access. The files run from the early 1950s through 1969, the year the program was formally closed. They cover thousands of incidents, assessed to varying levels of thoroughness, with varying conclusions. Some of them are from 1947, the year the modern era of reported aerial anomalies began. Among those files, on those labeled shelves, in that climate-controlled reading room, there is no case file for the Roswell incident. The surrounding files occupy their positions on the shelf. The space where a Roswell case file would sit, if one had been created, remains exactly as it has been since the collection was established and made available to researchers, present in its absence, a quiet and permanent gap in a row of otherwise continuous documentation, the labeled spines of adjacent files visible on either side of it, the archive itself continuing around it in every direction, orderly and still. Stanton Friedman is standing at a payphone somewhere in Baton Rouge in 1978, a piece of paper folded in his shirt pocket, with a name and a number written on it in his own hand. The tip had come through a mutual contact, a retired officer living quietly in Houma, Louisiana, a man who had not spoken publicly about what he had found on the ground in New Mexico 30 years before. Friedman had been tracing the Roswell incident for months by then, following names through old military directories, calling numbers that sometimes rang without answer, writing letters that sometimes came back unopened. This number was different. The man who answered was Jesse Marcel, and the conversation that followed would become the first stone in an entirely new structure built around a story that most of official America had decided was already finished. Marcel's account, recorded in that first interview and confirmed across subsequent conversations, described materials he said he had never encountered before or after in his military career. It described a substitution. It described a press conference in Fort Worth, where Marcel maintained the items spread on the floor for the photographers were not the same items he had loaded for transport from the Foster Ranch. For 30 years he had said none of this to anyone outside a small circle. For 30 years the official record had stood: weather balloon, radar reflector target, case resolved. And then Stanton Friedman found a phone number and called it, and the story that had been resting in silence since July of 1947 began, slowly and incrementally, to move again. The interview Marcel gave in 1978 became foundational. It became the bedrock on which a journalist named William Moore and a writer named Charles Berlitz constructed what would be the first full-length popular account of the incident. The book was called The Roswell Incident, and it was published in 1980. Before that book, the events of July 1947 in New Mexico were a largely forgotten footnote, known to a small community of researchers, referenced occasionally in the UFO literature, but absent from mainstream American conversation about the post-war period. After the book, the story was something else entirely. It was a cultural event. It was a controversy with named witnesses and documented institutional responses, and a 30-year silence suddenly and publicly broken. The book was not a scholarly work, and it contained claims that subsequent investigation found difficult or impossible to verify. It also contained the Jesse Marcel interview, which nobody disputed. One credible account, grounded in specific military service and specific physical description, was enough. The story did not go back to sleep after 1980. The town of Roswell, New Mexico, absorbed what had happened there in 1947 slowly, and then all at once. For decades, it was simply a small city in the southeastern part of the state, known primarily as a regional agricultural and commercial center. The events of that July were not a part of its public identity in any formal or organized way. Local memory existed, people who had been alive then, families who had heard things, fragments that passed between neighbors and across generations the way local knowledge does, informally and without institution. The formal transformation came later. The International UFO Museum and Research Center opened in Roswell in 1991, established by a small group that included Walter Haut, who had issued the original press release in 1947, and Max Littell, a local businessman. The museum began modestly in a converted former movie theater on North Main Street, and it grew. It now draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Its reading room holds binders of declassified documents, printed testimony transcripts, copies of FOIA responses, photographs, maps of the Foster Ranch area, architectural diagrams of hangars that may or may not have contained things the official record does not describe. The room is quiet in the early morning before the visitors arrive. The overhead lights are low, and the binders sit in their rows on the shelves, and the town outside is waking up, going about its business. The streets beginning to fill with the particular foot traffic of a place that has built part of its identity around an unresolved question. The annual UFO festival that Roswell hosts each summer has grown into something significant by any regional measure, a gathering of researchers, enthusiasts, filmmakers, families on road trips, people who came once and keep coming back, and people arriving for the first time with the specific anticipation of proximity to a mystery. The festival is not an academic conference, and it was never designed to be one. It is an experience, a civic event, a commercial enterprise, and a genuine community gathering, all of those things at once. The question of what actually fell on the Foster Ranch in June of 1947 is for most of the people who attend, secondary to the experience of being somewhere. The question has weight. The town and the story have become inseparable in a way that is now largely irreversible. Whatever the debris field was, it made Roswell into something it was not before. That making is itself a documented fact, even if everything around it remains unsettled. The national conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena changed in December of 2017 in a way that was, by any honest measure, unexpected. The New York Times published a story, alongside Politico, revealing the existence of a Pentagon program that had not previously been publicly acknowledged. The program was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and it had operated from approximately 2007 to 2012, funded at a level of $22 million drawn from the Defense Intelligence budget through a process that congressional representatives later described as having been arranged specifically to avoid conventional oversight channels. The program had investigated military encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena, reports filed by trained military pilots and sensor operators who had observed objects that behaved in ways that exceeded the documented performance of any known aircraft. The Times story included 3 declassified videos shot from Navy aircraft, footage of objects moving in ways that Navy pilots, interviewed on record, said they could not account for using any conventional understanding of aerodynamics or propulsion. The program's director, Luis Elizondo, resigned in 2017 and gave on-record interviews confirming that the program had taken the subject seriously and had reached no definitive technical explanation for certain observed phenomena. The significance of the December 2017 disclosure was not that it confirmed any particular explanation for any particular incident. It did not address Roswell. It did not describe extraterrestrial contact or retrieved craft. What it confirmed was that a serious, funded, formally organized government program had spent 5 years investigating military UAP encounters and had found the subject worthy of continued attention, and that this program had existed without public knowledge. The institutional climate for discussing unidentified aerial phenomena shifted after that disclosure. Congressional hearings that would have been difficult to convene in 2016 became possible in 2018. Military pilots who had declined to describe their encounters publicly began, in some cases, to speak on record. The Pentagon, which had spent decades treating the subject as outside the bounds of serious institutional engagement, began preparing formal processes for receiving and evaluating UAP reports from military personnel. None of that constitutes evidence about what fell on the Foster Ranch. It does constitute a documented change in the institutional environment within which historical cases like Roswell are discussed and, in some cases, formally reviewed. In June of 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena to Congress. The document covered 144 government-sourced reports of encounters with objects that could not be explained using available information. Of those 144 cases, the assessment was able to offer a tentative explanation: a deflated balloon, a passing aircraft, a sensor artifact for exactly one. The remaining 143 were described as unresolved. The assessment noted that a subset of the cases involved objects demonstrating flight characteristics that warranted further analysis, movement patterns, or performance envelopes that the available data did not account for. The document was careful in its language. It did not claim extraterrestrial origin for anything. It used the word unresolved, where a less cautious document might have used stronger terms, and it used the word analysis, where another context might have used explanation. It was a bureaucratic document, and it read like one, which is part of what made it notable. Bureaucratic documents are written to survive review. Bureaucratic documents use precise language, precisely because imprecision has institutional consequences. The 2021 assessment said, in precise language, that 143 encounters could not be explained, and left that statement to stand without elaboration, which is itself a form of elaboration. The assessment did not address Roswell. It did not address 1947. The events that Mac Brazel reported to Sheriff Wilcox in early July of that year, the debris field on the Foster Ranch, the press release and its retraction, the photographs taken in General Ramey's office, Jesse Marcel's 30 years of silence before speaking to Stanton Friedman, none of that appeared in the 2021 assessment, which was concerned with recent military encounters documented through sensor data and pilot testimony, not with historical incidents from the early post-war period. Advocates for further declassification of historical UAP-related material have argued that the 2021 assessment created a new institutional context in which requests for review of older classified files might be received differently than they had been before. Whether that argument has produced any change in the classification status of material related to the 1947 incident has not, as of the present, been publicly confirmed. The Freedom of Information Act process has run in parallel with the Roswell story for decades. Researchers and organizations have filed requests with the Air Force, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and other relevant entities, seeking records related to the 1947 incident and to any subsequent internal review. The results of those requests form a documentary record of their own, a record not of what happened in New Mexico in July of 1947, but of what the government has been willing to say about what it knows. Some requests have produced administrative records, internal routing slips, interoffice correspondence about how to respond to congressional inquiries, notes from meetings where officials discussed what could and could not be released. Some requests have produced documents in which every substantive paragraph is replaced by a solid bar of black ink, the classification header, and page numbers still visible at the top of the sheet, the document's existence confirmed while its content is withheld. In several cases, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency have acknowledged the existence of records responsive to a Roswell-related request, while declining to release those records under national security exemptions built into the Act's provisions. An acknowledged document that cannot be read occupies a strange position in any investigation. It confirms that something was written down. It confirms that whatever was written down was considered sensitive enough to require protection decades after the fact. It does not confirm what was written. The people who believe the 1947 incident involves something extraordinary look at an acknowledged but withheld document and find it significant. The people who believe the incident is fully explained by Project Mogul and its equipment look at the same document and note that agencies withhold records for many reasons, and that the existence of a classified file proves only its own existence. Both positions are defensible. Neither is fully satisfying. The document sits in its folder, in its drawer, in a facility whose climate-controlled corridors are maintained specifically to prevent deterioration, and it does not resolve anything simply by existing. There is a reading room in the International UFO Museum on North Main Street in Roswell, where the binders hold some of what the FOIA process has produced. The declassified documents sit beside copies of testimony transcripts and researchers' notes, organized by date and source, available to anyone who asks to see them. The room accumulates material the way any serious archive does, not quickly and not dramatically, but steadily, each new release or each newly obtained document adding one more page to a body of evidence that is both larger and more complicated than it was a decade ago. Researchers who have spent years with this material describe the experience of working in it as a slow process of addition, one small piece placed beside another, the picture not sharpening so much as expanding, the outline of what is known growing slightly more detailed, while the center of the question remains exactly where it has always been. That question, the center of it, the part that does not resolve, concerns the nature of what Mac Brazel found, spread across 3/4 of a mile of New Mexico scrubland in June of 1947. The Air Force has a documented answer. The 1994 report identified Project Mogul's New York University Flight 4 as the probable source of the debris, noted that the radar reflector targets used in the Mogul assembly were constructed with foil over balsa wood frames and reinforced with tape carrying printed geometric symbols in pinkish-purple ink, and argued that the classified nature of the program explained both the secrecy of the military retrieval and the original press release's error. The explanation accounts for much of the documentary record. It does not, according to the researchers who have examined it most carefully, account for all of it. The timeline has gaps. The specific physical descriptions provided by Jesse Marcel Sr. and Jesse Marcel Jr. describe properties, material that returned to its original shape when crumpled, lightweight structures that could not be cut or burned, that go beyond what the components of a Mogul assembly would produce. The Air Force says those descriptions are inaccurate or embellished by memory across 3 decades. The witnesses said they were not. The record does not provide a method for resolving that disagreement with certainty, and so it sits, unresolved, inside the larger body of the case. 30 years of silence, and then a conversation. Jesse Marcel Sr. sat across a table from Stanton Friedman in Houma, Louisiana, and began to describe what he had found on the Foster Ranch in the first days of July 1947. He was specific. He was calm. He was a man in the late years of his life who had decided to say, finally, what he had not said before. Researchers who have examined his account note that his descriptions remained consistent across multiple interviews given before his death in 1986. The same material properties, the same description of the substitution at Fort Worth, the same quiet certainty about what he had handled and what he had not. Consistency across time and across interviewers is not proof. It is a feature of credible testimony. It is also a feature of a well-maintained false account. The record cannot determine which it is, and the record is honest enough to say so. Jesse Marcel Jr., who was 12 years old when his father came home in the early hours of July 8, 1947, and laid pieces of material across the kitchen table for him to examine, described those pieces specifically and consistently for the rest of his own life. He described small I-beam-like structures with unusual markings, purplish-pink symbols that he said were not lettering in any alphabet he had ever encountered. He became a medical doctor and an Army helicopter pilot. He was not a man whose professional background encouraged credulous interpretation of unusual experiences. He maintained his account publicly until his death in 2013. Two witnesses, separated in age by decades, and speaking from different vantage points within the same early morning event, describing the same unusual materials with the same specific properties across the same span of years. That convergence is noted. It is not by itself an explanation. It is a feature of the record that sits alongside everything else the record contains, waiting for a context that would make it fully legible. The General Accounting Office conducted its records audit in 1995 at the request of Congressman Stephen Schiff, who had described what he called bureaucratic stonewalling by the Department of Defense in response to his own inquiries. The audit was looking for any federal records related to the recovery of unusual materials from the New Mexico crash site in 1947. What the audit found, among other things, was that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for a period covering all of 1947 had been destroyed. The destruction had occurred without the proper authorization required under the records retention regulations then in effect. The audit report noted the absence without characterizing it beyond the documentary finding itself. The messages were gone. The destruction was unauthorized. The period covered included the relevant dates. Investigators who believe the 1947 incident involved something extraordinary look at the destroyed records and find significance in the destruction. Investigators who believe the Mogul explanation is sufficient look at the same records and note that military records from the post-war period were often poorly maintained, that unauthorized destruction was not uncommon, that the absence proves only an absence. The audit report itself, which is a GAO document and not an advocacy document, says what it says and draws the conclusions the evidence supports, which are administrative conclusions about records management practice rather than conclusions about what the records contained. The shelf in the National Archives, where a Project Blue Book case file for the 1947 Roswell incident would be stored, is occupied on either side by files with numbers and case designations that are clearly readable on their tabs. The Roswell space is not there. Blue Book, which operated from 1952 to 1969 and accumulated files on thousands of reported UAP incidents across that period, contains no case number and no investigation record for what happened in New Mexico in July of 1947. The Air Force's explanation is that the case had been resolved before Blue Book existed, and so was not part of the program's scope. The explanation is administratively coherent. The Roswell incident, resolved officially as a weather balloon in July of 1947, would have had no reason to enter the Blue Book system created 5 years later to handle incoming unresolved cases. The critics of the Mogul explanation look at the same empty space on the shelf and ask whether a case that had been genuinely resolved, a case whose explanation was a mundane weather instrument, would need to be kept out of the system, or whether it simply would not have been relevant to include. The question the shelf does not answer is whether the absence is the absence of something that was never there, or the absence of something that was removed. The shelf looks the same in either case. The climate-controlled federal records storage facilities where classified material from the post-war period is held are functional, unremarkable places. Long corridors, fluorescent lighting, metal shelving in rows, the mechanical sound of ventilation systems, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity conditions that prevent document deterioration. The people who work in those facilities move through them with the specific unhurried efficiency of archivists, opening boxes, checking condition, updating location records, moving material from temporary storage to permanent storage and back again, according to schedules and protocols that have nothing to do with the content of any specific file. The content is, in a sense, incidental to the work. The work is preservation. The work is making sure the documents are still there, still readable, still available to whatever process will eventually determine whether they should be released. Some of those documents are known to exist. They are acknowledged in FOIA responses, their administrative reference numbers recorded, their existence confirmed, their contents withheld. They sit in their labeled folders, in their labeled boxes, on their labeled shelves, and the room around them is kept at exactly the right temperature, and the ventilation system runs steadily, and the building outside those corridors goes on being the kind of building it is, present, functional, unremarkable from the outside, holding inside it whatever it holds. The Roswell story is now old enough to have its own historiography, its own documented history of how it has been told, retold, disputed, revised, and transmitted across time. The original press release is a historical document. The retraction is a historical document. The 1994 Air Force report is a historical document. The GAO audit is a historical document. Jesse Marcel's interviews are recorded and archived. The sealed affidavit that Walter Haut left to be opened after his death is a document. The FOIA responses with their black bars of redaction are documents. The empty space in the Blue Book files is a documented absence. All of it is real. All of it is part of the record. The record is larger than any single explanation of it, and more complicated, and it does not resolve into simplicity when examined closely. It resolves into more detail, which is what records tend to do when examined closely. They produce more questions alongside the answers they contain, and the questions and the answers sit together in the archive, equally preserved, equally available to anyone who comes looking. The town of Roswell goes on. The museum opens in the morning and closes in the evening. The reading room receives its visitors and its researchers. The binders sit in their rows. The declassified documents accumulate. The scrubland north of town, the rangeland that stretches up toward Corona, and the old Foster Ranch property is still there, dry and flat and wide under a New Mexico sky that in summer is so blue it looks painted. The ranch itself is private land. The specific location of the debris field, mapped in the 1994 Air Force report as a function of the reconstructed trajectory of Mogul Flight 4, is a point on a map that anyone can see but very few people visit. It looks like the rest of the rangeland. It looks like scrub and dry soil, and the particular quality of stillness that wide-open high desert terrain produces in the middle of the day when the heat is full and the light is flat and nothing moves. Whatever was there in June of 1947, spread across 3/4 of a mile in a long directional field, is long since gone, gathered and transported and documented or not documented, explained or not explained, gone either way from the ground where Mac Brazel found it in the early morning while walking his pasture. What remains is the record, and the questions the record does not answer, and the people who have spent years with both. Stanton Friedman, who made the call that started the modern phase of the story, continued researching the incident for the rest of his long life and maintained, until his death in 2019, that the evidence supported a conclusion beyond Project Mogul. The Air Force, which published 2 formal reports and has not revised them, maintains otherwise. The GAO audit is what it is. The destroyed RAAF messages are what they are. The acknowledged and withheld documents are what they are. The testimonies of Jesse Marcel Sr. and Jesse Marcel Jr. are what they are. The sealed affidavit of Walter Hott, opened after his death and containing claims that no surviving witness could cross-examine, is what it is. The Blue Book shelf is what it is. The record holds all of these things simultaneously and does not adjudicate between them, because records do not adjudicate. They preserve, they make available, they wait. There is something particular about a story that has generated this much paperwork over this many decades and arrived after all of it at a place that still cannot be called settled. The official explanation is documented and detailed and plausible and incomplete. The alternative accounts are specific and consistent and unverifiable and persistent. The institutional environment around the subject has changed in ways that seemed, not long ago, unlikely. New documents will be released through the FOIA process. New requests will be filed. New hearings will be held. The questions that the record currently cannot answer will either find answers or they will not, and either outcome will itself become part of the record, added to the archive, preserved, available, filed alongside everything that came before it. Somewhere in a federal records facility, in a labeled box on a numbered shelf, there are documents that have not been read outside the agencies that hold them since the classification was applied. The documents are in good condition. The facility maintains the temperature and humidity that good archival practice requires, because the people who work in those facilities are professionals who do their work with care, regardless of what the material contains. The boxes sit on their shelves in their rows. The ventilation system runs steadily. The room is quiet and still, and the light inside it is the particular flat quality of fluorescent light in a space with no windows. The kind of light that does not change with the time of day, that makes morning and evening and the middle of the night indistinguishable from one another. The documents inside those boxes have experienced no day or night for years.